Suddenly, the young woman with the phone camera spoke up again, her voice loud and clear. "You can't just demand ID like this. He's not doing anything wrong." Her words were met with a few supportive murmurs from the crowd, but the officers didn't budge. It felt like the balance was tipping, one wrong move, and the situation could escalate into something far uglier than just a simple ID refusal. The officer closest to the man took a breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to do. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice cold and authoritative. "If you don't show us your ID, we're going to have to detain you." The crowd went silent. All eyes were on the man now, waiting for his response. The young woman with the camera zoomed in, capturing every moment, every shift in the officer's expressions. But the man just tilted his head slightly, as though considering his options. A heavy silence lingered in the air, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint sound of birds overhead. The tension hung in the balance, and no one knew how this would end. Would he comply? Would the officers back down? Or was something far more dangerous about to unfold? Just as the man seemed poised to speak, the sound of a siren cut through the still air, sharp and sudden. It was distant at first, but then it grew louder, heading straight for the scene. The crowd shifted uneasily, and the officers looked up, their expressions flickering between confusion and concern. No one had expected this. The siren grew closer, and then, in the blink of an eye, a second police vehicle pulled up, lights flashing, engine idling with a menacing hum. A new officer stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose presence immediately commanded attention. His gaze swept over the situation, locking onto the two female officers and then the man in question. There was a moment of hesitation before he made his way over, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and firm, but with a sharp edge of authority that hinted at years of experience. The first officer, clearly rattled by the sudden arrival, opened her mouth to explain, but before she could, the man stepped in front of her. The crowd tensed, sensing a change in the air. The newcomer, who clearly wasn't part of the original stop, had a look in his eyes that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just there to back up the situation. There was something else in his gaze, something more intense, as if he had come for a reason far beyond enforcing a simple ID check. "Are you serious?" the man in question asked, his voice suddenly louder, more defiant. He took a small step back, as though to separate himself from the officers entirely. "You're gonna escalate this because I won't show you my ID." In front of all these people. The second officer, who had just arrived, raised an eyebrow. "You better watch your tone," he warned, his hand moving to his belt, though he didn't draw anything just yet. "You're making this a lot worse than it needs to be." But it wasn't just the officers' reactions that were now taking center stage. The crowd, once passive, was now murmuring more insistently. The young woman with the camera zoomed in once again, her voice ringing out. "You're just gonna let them intimidate him like this? What happened to respecting people's rights?" The man glanced at her, a small but knowing smile on his face. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was a smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment. He stepped backward slowly, his eyes locked on the newcomer officer, before he suddenly turned his back, taking 2 quick steps toward his car. "Where do you think you're going?" One of the female officers snapped, her voice now desperate, her authority slipping. But as the man reached for his car door handle, the unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed through the air. Was it a gunshot? The crowd froze. The officers scrambled, their hands twitching at their holsters, unsure of what was happening. A dark SUV screeched to a stop behind the crowd, its tinted windows reflecting the lights from the flashing police vehicles. And then the man did something no one saw coming. He didn't run. Instead, he opened his car door and slowly reached inside, as if retrieving something or someone. The crowd watched in shock as he pulled out a second figure, a woman, dazed and disoriented, her eyes wide in panic. It was the moment that changed everything. The officers froze, their faces paling as the situation suddenly escalated into something far more complicated. This wasn't just about a simple ID check anymore, and no one knew what would happen next. The crowd gasped as the woman stumbled out of the car, her eyes wild with fear. She was clearly shaken, her clothes disheveled, and it wasn't hard to tell that something wasn't right. The officers stood frozen for a split second, unsure whether to rush in or wait for further instructions. The young woman filming had stopped speaking, her camera now focused entirely on the scene unfolding before them. The first officer, her face pale, took a step forward, her voice trembling. "What is this? Who is she?" she demanded, her hand still hovering near her radio, as though it might somehow offer an escape from the mounting pressure. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully guided the woman towards him, his body positioned protectively in front of her. "She's not part of this," he said, his tone low but firm. "But if you want to know who I am, maybe you should start asking the right questions." The second officer, who had been standing off to the side, his hand still hovering near his weapon, was visibly rattled. "What the hell does that mean?" His voice was tight, edged with anger and confusion. He was clearly on the verge of losing control. But before he could press any further, the woman, still shaking, spoke up in a breathless whisper. He's not who you think he is." Her words were barely audible, but they sent a ripple through the crowd. The officers, now looking at each other with growing unease, exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" the first officer asked, her voice losing some of its initial authority. The woman paused, as if trying to gather her strength. Then she turned her gaze to the man, her eyes wide with fear. "He's not just some guy who refuses to show his ID. Her voice cracked, but before she could say anything else, the man held up a hand, silencing her. "This needs to stop," he said firmly, turning his attention back to the officers. "You're not prepared for what you're about to uncover." There was a coldness in his voice now, something that made the officers pause, their own uncertainty creeping in. The siren wail still hung in the air, but it was the arrival of the dark SUV that had thrown everything off course. The man glanced over his shoulder at it, and just as the officers took a step forward, a figure emerged from the vehicle, an older man, dressed in a sharp suit, his face hidden by dark sunglasses. He didn't look like a cop. He didn't look like anyone who belonged in this. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the quiet street, but the tension was anything but calm. Two female officers, determined to assert control, approached a man standing near his car. "Let me see your ID," one demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. But the man didn't move. His eyes narrowed as he calmly replied, "Why do I need to show it?" That single question sent the interaction spiraling in an unexpected direction. What followed would leave everyone questioning who really held the power. The officers, used to getting what they wanted, were suddenly caught off guard as the man refused to back down. With the situation escalating, their authority began to crumble in real time. Was this just a simple misunderstanding, or was it something more? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you shocked and wondering what the true limits of power really are. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their professional masks slipping just for a moment. They were trained to handle defiance, but something about this encounter felt different. The man wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't backing down either. It wasn't the typical routine stop. They were just checking for identification, something so common in their line of work. But he stood there, calm and unshaken, with a hint of something almost daring in his posture. The tension grew with every passing second, and the surrounding silence only made it worse. Nearby, a few pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing the unease but unsure whether to intervene. One of the officers stepped forward, her voice more insistent now. "You're required to show your ID. If you don't, we'll have to take further action." The man, however, just stared at her, unblinking. What was his game? Why wasn't he cooperating? Was there something more beneath the surface? The officer's hand hovered near her radio, fingers twitching as though weighing the next move. Her partner, still watching the man closely, shifted her stance, trying to read him. There was something in his eyes, calm, calculating, that unsettled her. "This isn't a negotiation," the second officer muttered, her patience thinning. But the man remained silent, his gaze unwavering. The world around them seemed to slow down as the minutes stretched on. A small crowd had gathered just a few feet away, some recording the interaction, others whispering, but no one daring to step in. The officers could feel it, the pressure of the moment. The officers stood in stunned silence as the SUV disappeared into the distance, leaving only the sound of their own breath and the distant hum of traffic. The radio crackled again, but this time it was just static. They looked at each other, trying to process what had just happened. The truth was, they didn't know what they'd walked into, but they were certain they'd only scratched the surface. Days later, the incident made headlines. The footage from the crowd circulated online, with people speculating wildly. Was it a high-profile cover-up? A test of power and control? No one knew for sure. But the officers, left to grapple with the aftermath, knew one thing: their lives had changed in an instant. The system they thought they understood had just been turned upside down, and they weren't sure they'd ever be able to look at the world the same way again. The real story, it was far from over.